Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today we're going deep, really deep into gene editing. It's complex, it's controversial, and it's in the headlines constantly. We need to understand it.
It's about more than just science, though, isn't it? This has implications for our food, our environment, even our values as a society.
Absolutely. So let's break it all down, shall we? What exactly is gene editing? And how is it different from, traditional genetic modification? I feel like those terms get used interchangeably sometimes.
That's a crucial distinction to make. Imagine for a moment that you're trying to perfect, say, a recipe. Genetic modification. That's like adding a whole new ingredient. It might work, it might create something interesting, but it can also be unpredictable. You don't know what you're going to get.
Right.
Gene editing, on the other hand, that's more like fine-tuning an ingredient you already have, making precise adjustments to achieve a specific outcome.
So instead of adding, I don't know, a dash of hot sauce, we're adjusting the amount of salt that's already in the recipe.
Precisely. It's about making very targeted changes to an organism's existing DNA. Often changes that, well, could occur naturally through generations of evolution. But gene editing allows us to do it with precision and speed.
So we're seeing this technology being used right now, aren't we? I mean, I read about those gene-edited tomatoes designed to promote calmness. It's fascinating.
Yes, and that's just one example. We're seeing research into things like heat-resistant cattle, disease-resistant crops, even ways to reduce methane emissions from livestock.
It's incredible, but I have to imagine there are concerns with this level of, technological advancement.
Of course, any new technology, especially one with this kind of, well, far-reaching implications, is going to come with unknowns. There are legitimate questions about safety, about the potential for unintended consequences, the impact on biodiversity. Those are all valid concerns.
And on top of all that, it seems like the rules surrounding gene editing, they're all over the place, right?
Absolutely. Different countries are taking different approaches. It's quite a complex landscape. The UK, for instance, they recently decided to pause legislation around gene-edited food. That decision has fueled, well, quite a bit of debate, actually, among scientists and policymakers about the best way to move forward. Meanwhile, other countries, like the US, China, even New Zealand, are pushing ahead with developing their own regulations.
So the world is what kind of divided on how to handle this?
There are definitely different perspectives emerging. Some are calling for strict regulations similar to those governing what we call genetically modified organisms, GMOs. Others argue for a more, well, flexible approach because gene editing, in their view, is about precision, not introducing foreign DNA.
So even the definition of gene editing is up for debate.
It is. It's a nuanced debate. And it's, well, further complicated by the fact that for the general public, the perception of gene editing and genetic modification, they're often kind of intertwined.
Right, they both sound like, genetic engineering to most people.
Exactly. And those distinctions, those finer points, they can get lost.
So where does the UK stand in all of this? They were the ones who hit pause on that legislation, right?
Right. The UK, they've actually been a leader in gene editing research, along with the US and China. Last year, the previous government, they passed something called the Precision Breeding Act. The intention was to clear the way for the commercial sale of gene-edited food in England.
That sounds like a pretty significant move.
It was seen as a major step, yes, by many in the scientific community at least, but then a change in government and the need for further legislation. Well, those things have put the brakes on the Act's implementation, for now anyway.
So it's a waiting game.
Essentially, the new government is currently reviewing the situation. They're planning to discuss the path forward with key stakeholders. But this delay, it has raised some concerns, particularly among scientists.
What are they concerned about?
They fear that this pause could hinder the UK's progress, especially in such a rapidly developing field. Other countries like Thailand, Canada, Australia, several others, they're moving much faster in establishing their own regulations for gene editing. And that could give them a competitive edge, globally speaking.
So there's a sense of urgency then.
Yes, many scientists believe that the UK, with its history of world-leading research in genetics, they can't afford to fall behind. They argue that gene editing has enormous potential to address some of the world's most pressing issues, and that delaying its development and implementation, well, it could have significant consequences.
So it's not just about scientific progress then, it's economic, maybe even political.
It's all interconnected. If the UK remains cautious while other countries are moving full steam ahead, there's a real concern that it could impact trade relations, their ability to compete in a global market, one that's increasingly embracing gene-edited products.
It's a complicated balancing act, isn't it? Weighing the potential benefits of this technology against the need for caution.
Exactly, and that's why it's so important to have these conversations. This isn't just a topic for scientists and policymakers. It affects all of us. We need to think about the potential benefits, the risks, the ethical implications, the economic factors at play. It's complex, but it's a conversation we need to have. It's complex, and to be honest, it gets even more complex because the line between gene editing and genetic modification, well, it can be a bit blurry. Even within the scientific community, there's some debate.
But we did make a distinction between the two, didn't we? We talked about fine-tuning versus adding a whole new ingredient.
We did, yes, in theory at least. Gene editing, it's about making very specific changes to an organism's, existing DNA, whereas genetic modification often involves introducing something foreign, DNA from a completely different species.
Right, like that example, adding a gene from a scorpion to cotton to make it pest-resistant.
Exactly, and here's where it gets a bit murky. Some gene editing techniques, they might actually use foreign DNA as a kind of template for the desired change, you see, even though that foreign DNA isn't directly incorporated into the final organism. So then the question becomes, is that still gene editing or is it more that genetic modification? And that distinction, it has major implications when you start talking about, regulations and oversight.
So on top of everything else, there's debate about the very definition of gene editing.
There is. It's nuanced. And it's further complicated by the fact that for the average person, the perception of gene editing and genetic modification, they're often they're intertwined.
So they both just sound like, I don't know, genetic engineering.
Exactly. And those distinctions, those finer points, they get lost in translation, so to speak.
It's easy to see how that could happen. I mean, public perception, it's not always shaped by, the finer scientific detail.
Yeah, it's not. And this is where the ethical dimension becomes really important. Because public trust in science and technology, it's crucial. And any perceived risk, any lack of transparency, it can really erode that trust.
Especially when you're talking about something as, fundamental as the food we eat.
Precisely. Open and transparent conversations about gene editing, they're essential. And it's not just about scientists and policymakers having these conversations. It's about consumers, ethicists, anyone who might be impacted by this technology. Because make no mistake, this has the potential to reshape our world in profound ways.
It sounds like you're advocating for a more cautious approach, moving away from those, those all or nothing stances.
And I think that's wise, yes. It's not about being for or against gene editing. It's about recognizing that this is a powerful tool, one that has the potential for both significant benefits and significant risks. And we have a collective responsibility, I think, to make sure that its development and its use are guided by solid science, ethical considerations, and a genuine commitment to transparency and public engagement.
That's a big task. So as we're, trying to navigate this complex landscape,
Right.
what are some of the key questions we should be asking? What should we be focusing on?
I think one of the most critical questions is, where do we draw the line? What applications of gene editing are acceptable and what applications cross the line? For example, there might be widespread support for using gene editing to, say, eliminate diseases or to improve the nutritional value of crops, things like that. But using it for cosmetic purposes or to enhance certain traits in humans, that's a whole other conversation.
Yeah.
One that's likely to be met with, much more resistance, I think.
It's that designer babies debate we've been hearing about for years.
Precisely, and that's just one example of the ethical dilemmas we're facing. Another critical question is, who benefits from gene editing? And perhaps more importantly, who bears the risks? If this technology is primarily driven by, say, commercial interests, there's a real risk that it could worsen existing inequalities. The benefits might end up concentrated in the hands of a few, while others are left behind.
That's a concern with a lot of emerging technologies, isn't it? We've seen that pattern before.
We have, and it's something we need to be mindful of. And then there's the issue of, unintended consequences. We've talked about the potential ecological risks. But there are also social and economic risks to consider. For instance, if gene-edited crops, let's say, become the norm, could that lead to even more consolidation of power within the agricultural industry, potentially squeezing out small-scale farmers?
It's a lot to think of. It sounds like we need some serious foresight and planning to make sure that the benefits of gene editing are, shared fairly and that we're doing everything we can to mitigate those risks.
Absolutely. It requires a shift in perspective, I think. We can't just think about gene editing as a technological challenge. We have to recognize the profound social, ethical, and environmental dimensions. It's not just about what we can do with gene editing, but what we should do with it.
That's a powerful statement. I think it's a good place to pause for now. We've covered a lot of ground, but this conversation is far from over. We've been talking about, as you put it, the profound implications of gene editing, the potential benefits, the risks. It feels like we're at a crossroads with this technology.
We are. We are at a pivotal point, really. The decisions that we make about gene editing today, those decisions will have implications for generations to come. And it's not enough to just debate the science, you know. I think we need a broader societal conversation about the kind of future we're actually working towards.
It sounds like you're calling for a more participatory approach to science and technology, one where the public has a real voice in shaping how these advancements are developed and used.
Exactly. Scientists and policymakers, they have a responsibility to be transparent with the public about the potential benefits, about the risks of gene editing. But it's also on all of us to stay informed, to ask questions, you know, the hard questions, and to hold those in power accountable.
It's about moving beyond the fear and the hype that always seems to surround new technologies and really grappling with the complexities.
We need to move away from, simplistic narratives. This idea that gene editing is either a perfect solution or a disaster waiting to happen. The reality is far more nuanced, as we've discussed.
So for those of us who want to be part of this conversation, who want to engage in a meaningful way, where do we even begin?
There are many ways to engage. Start by seeking out reliable information. Look to scientific journals, reputable news sources, organizations dedicated to responsible innovation in this field. Engage in thoughtful conversations. Talk to people who hold different viewpoints than your own. Attend public forums, webinars, those kinds of things. And never underestimate the importance of making your voice heard. Reach out to your elected officials. Let them know what you think.
It's about recognizing that we have a role to play in shaping the future of these technologies.
Absolutely. This gene editing debate, it's really a reflection of our shared humanity. It forces us to confront, I think, our hopes, our fears, our responsibility to future generations. And by approaching this conversation with thoughtfulness, with a commitment to understanding, I believe we can harness the power of gene editing for good, while navigating, of course, the complex ethical challenges that it presents.
That's a powerful thought to end on, I think. We've explored the science, the potential, and the very real concerns surrounding gene editing. I hope this deep dive has given you, the listener, a solid understanding of this complex and rapidly evolving field.
Knowledge is power, as they say. The more informed we are as a society, the better equipped we'll be to make responsible choices about the future.
And on that note, we'll wrap up this deep dive into the world of gene editing. We hope you found it insightful. Until next time, keep asking questions and keep diving deep.